last night was a tragedy.
Akai Gurley was shot and killed by police officer Peter Liang. The charges are manslaughter in the second degree. As a Chinese officer, they threw him under the bus.
My nephew's life was taken.
100,000 Chinese Americans come out.
What do you want?
It is not because he's Asian that we're going after him. We were going after that institution that killed Akai.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Vera Boggs. I'm here with with OCA Greater Cleveland. I'm also here with Danielle Littleton, who's our partner for this program, along with editor Jason Harper. We're going to have a quick discussion to talk about reactions to the movie. But before we get started, just going to do some quick introductions. As I mentioned, I'm with OCA Greater Cleveland. We are a membership-driven organization of community advocates dedicated to advancing the social, political, and economic well-being of Asian Pacific Americans and promoting cultural heritage, active participation in civic and community affairs, securing justice, equal treatment, and equal opportunity to the growing Asian community in Northeast Ohio. Also here with me from OCA Greater Cleveland is our president, Lisa Wong.
Thank you for joining us today.
Okay. I'm going to turn it over now to Danielle Littleton with the Legal Aid Society of Cleveland. They, as I mentioned, they are our partner organization for this film today. Thank you.
Thank you, Vera. As she said, I'm Danielle Littleton. I am an attorney with the Legal Aid Society of Cleveland. I'm part of our medical legal partnerships where we partner with medical institutions to serve the civil legal needs of people. I specifically work with university hospitals, but the mission of the Legal Aid Society of Cleveland generally is to serve the civil legal needs of people in poverty. And so we focus on fairness and equity. And whereas you have a right to an attorney in a criminal case, in civil legal issues that focus on basic legal needs, you may not always have access to an attorney. And so we look to fill that gap through our nonprofit to provide legal services in the areas of housing, safety, and economic security.
Thank you. And next we have Jason Harper, who is with us from Down a Dark Stairwell. He was the editor on this film. He has told us that Ursula would have loved to have been here, but she just recently had a baby boy. Jason.
Yeah, that's right. Ursula, who is the director of the documentary Down a Dark Stairwell, which premieres tonight on PBS. She would have loved to be here. We've done a number of Q&As together, and I'm looking forward to hearing the questions that we have to answer today. I'm a film director and editor myself, and this is my fourth feature documentary. I'm currently working on a feature-length documentary on Kanye West, and yeah, I'm just excited to get into the dialogue.
Okay, and just a quick summary of Down a Dark Stairwell. I'm going to read here from the summary that we were given. It is a documentary about a Chinese American police officer who killed an innocent unarmed Black man in an unlit stairwell of a New York City housing project on November 20th, 2014. Communities across the city erupted with demands for legal accountability. When he becomes the first New York Police Department officer convicted of an on-duty shooting in over a decade, the fight for justice becomes much more complicated. One of the largest Asian American protests in history challenges an uneven legal system, while the African American community is forced to defend its rights again after a series of police killings. Cries for justice amid systemic inequities find disparate notions of fairness and notions of fairness are called into question. And unfortunately, this has become even more relevant in today's society. When this happened, this was before the whole George Floyd incident, and there has been countless other incidents in between from the time of Akai Gurley's killing until the present day. So we're just going to ask you a few questions, and the audience, anytime you have any questions, please type it in and we'll try to get those presented. So when we were watching this film, I noticed that you made it a point to try and make sure that both the perspective from the Asian community and the African American community was equally portrayed. I found that was very well done in trying to be neutral, let the viewers make their own decision about the whole outcome. Was that done intentionally?
Absolutely. From the very beginning of the process, it was Ursula's intention to make sure that at the end of the documentary, really two things. One, that it was not a film about the trial, so it wasn't meant for viewers to watch it and to come away from it just having seen a trial in action. It was about something much deeper that was happening on a community level, and that had to do with communities, whether or not those communities would divide or unite against what was a larger institution. And then secondly, to make sure that at the end of the documentary, that the film was giving equitable time to both sides of what happened and allowing the audience to think for themselves and that way to try to honor both communities and where they were coming from, who have had two very different historical relationships with the police, two very different between the Asian American community and the African American community, two very different generational journeys to being where they are as populations, where we are as populations in the States. And that caused, as you saw in the film and saw in real life, a very real and complicated conflict that the film revolved around.
Okay. And then something else I noticed was that you had interviews with the Asian communities, you had interviews with the African American communities, but it didn't seem like you had any interviews with anybody that was white.
Right. Yeah, that was it was, again, that was a deliberate decision on Ursula's part, just because even in the news media, that the archive excerpts that we pulled into the film, you'll notice that even the news reporters are either Black or Asian or minority, and that was because most of the time when you see stories told about our communities, about Asian American communities or Black American communities, they are often framed through a lens of their relationship with the white community. And Ursula thought that it would be interesting and important to allow the story to be told internally between the communities, because we were dealing with an Asian American officer and a Black man who was shot. Of course, involved in that were white officers. For example, the partner of Peter Liang was a white officer. And as you see in the documentary, there was an interaction, an important interaction that happened between him and Peter Liang outside the stairwell. But importantly, it is a story about these two communities and sort of a tale of those two cities. And that was a deliberate decision on Ursula's part, not so much to exclude any one community, not to exclude the white community, but to give to offer something different than what is typically out there, and to say, what if we were to tell this story of these two communities from the perspective of the two communities alone? That was absolutely deliberate.
Okay. We have a question here. Do you know what the current relationship is between the Chinese and African American community groups that were featured in the movie?
That's a good question. Unfortunately, there isn't a lot of historically, there hasn't been a lot of interaction between the Asian American community and African American community in terms of organizing. It's more often, as you saw in the very contentious protests that happened on the street, you saw that the communities were shouting at each other. Very rarely did you see it did happen, but very rarely did you see a sort of dialogue happening between the two sides in that kind of fraught atmosphere. It does happen, and when it did happen, the dialogue was fascinating. But in terms of the organizers on both sides, as far as I know, and this certainly was the case when the documentary was made, there are very it's a very highly emotional and triggering case for them. And unfortunately, because of the pandemic, we didn't have the opportunity to screen this as Ursula would have liked to screen this with both communities present. That would have at least been able to serve as some type of bridge for that dialogue to happen. But I do know absolutely that it is it's a very difficult union of sides to happen. And I think both, as you saw in the end of the documentary, on both the Akai Gurley and the Peter Liang side, it's very complicated in terms of who thinks that justice has been reached in this case, or what that justice is, or whether really the word appeasement is used, whether even if the ruling went a certain way, as it did at one point, that did not appease the Black community. And of course, I don't think I'm spoiling anything. Hopefully everyone has seen the film who's watching this. That things kind of shifted one way and the other. But even that, the Asian American community, there were very strong voices on the Asian American community side saying, this is not something that we celebrate. No one wins in this situation. It's not something that's cause for joy for the verdict to be reached, but it's again, an unearthed complication. But that's sort of a long answer to the question. In short, these communities do not frequently talk to each other, except in the person of or in entities like the ones that you saw, where there were, for example, Asian Americans for Black in support of Black communities, specific organizations who are formed explicitly for that purpose. And that tends to be the younger generation. There's a very clear, as you saw in the documentary, generational divide in the Asian American community in terms of the difference between those who came over in the 90s, those who came over earlier than that in the mid 1900s, to a very distinct immigration stories and two very distinct relationships with the police. So I hope that answers the question.
Okay. Going back to something that you mentioned in your answers, that it was triggering. And this incident happened on November 20th. And soon after, we had the Tamir Rice shooting in Cleveland that occurred like 2 days later. And then 2 days after that, Officer Darren Wilson was acquitted for killing Michael Brown in Ferguson.
Right.
And then it seemed like within a week or so, we also had the acquittal of Daniel Pantaleo, who was from Staten Island, who was acquitted of killing Eric Gardner, who was placed in chokehold. So these all came like one after another. Do you think, or was there any feelings from the people that you're interacting with that saw Peter Liang being used as a scapegoat to try to like appease people, like you were saying, after seeing all this happening with police getting, quote unquote, getting away with their crime?
Right. I think that's exactly the argument that was being made on the Asian American side. And again, the documentary works very hard to empathize with both the Asian American side and the African American side, leaving viewers of the documentary often perplexed because that empathy is achieved on either side. I think in terms of in the documentary and speaking with the organizers on the African American side, the term scapegoat is a very incorrect one to use because from the Akai Gurley side's perspective, a scapegoat is someone who you blame when they haven't done anything wrong. But obviously, Akai Gurley was indicted and convicted of firing a weapon that killed Akai Gurley. Whether intentionally or unintentionally, it's something that happened. And so the Black community took issue with that word scapegoat, which is interpreted by the Black community to mean someone whose hands are totally clean of any wrongdoing. And then, of course, on the other side, the Asian American community was using the term scapegoat more in the sense that other people have done this, and there's a sort of moral equivalence going on where if white officers have done this and gotten away with it, why does an Asian American officer who does the same thing, arguably not intentionally, like arguably accidentally misfires his weapon and an accident happens? But even though there are very, especially nowadays, especially in 2020, very distinct cases where it's very, very hard to argue that some of the police brutality was accidental. That you have, you had a case where because of the background of the officer, because he was a rookie cop, because he was afraid, he was patrolling an area that he was afraid to patrol. He was improperly trained by the police academy. Wasn't, according to his testimony, wasn't properly taught CPR. They just kind of passed these recruits through. This was somebody who arguably did not wake up that morning and say, "I'm going to go and kill somebody in the projects tonight," arguably. So the term scapegoat is a contentious one on both sides, and I think one thing that we saw throughout the documentary is the use of there was a word that means one thing to one community and another thing to the other community. And with the Asian American community too, you saw it was very interesting because in terms of the younger generation who is typically fluent, and you have the older generations or two generations above, some of which did not have the same fluency level as the younger ones, and had latched onto certain phrases, scapegoat being one of them. And it's one of those terms that just kept being used, but it sort of added fuel to the fire because there wasn't a common core set of facts about what even the terminology meant. So,
okay. So we have a question here. They said, one thing I wondered during the film was whether the police force supported Peter Lang and how this support might have differed compared to the other police shootings. Was this left out intentionally?
That's a really good question. So that is complicated. The reason it was left out of the documentary is because most of the officers who had input on that. First of all, there was not a unilateral response from the police. There wasn't full support for Peter, and there wasn't full sort of denial of Peter. There was anecdotally from some interviews that were taken but not included in the documentary. And this was actually with a retired Chinese American officer that they sort of, in his words, they saw Peter as sort of a dumb cop who made a stupid mistake and misfired his weapon by having his finger on the trigger instead of safely to the side of it. There's not a lot of love for Peter in the police force from the interviews that we conducted, and I think from the perspective of the white officers in the police force, I think that an occurrence like this certainly brought to the foreground issues that were uncomfortable ones for them to deal with. So in no way was Peter, even though Peter. And I saw in the comments that some people haven't seen the documentary yet, so I don't want to ruin the ending. But I feel like I have to say that even though Peter, in the end, did not end up going to prison and received probation, and what many on the Kai Gurley side saw it to be is just a slap on the wrist. That did not equate to police endorsement of Peter, and I think he had a very rough time actually in the system, regardless of how it turned out in the end.
Okay, with regards to the sentencing, you sort of gave it away that he didn't get any jail time, in other cities where like the police were acquitted, there was protest afterwards.
Right.
But in this case, what was the reaction, the public reactions after the sentencing?
Yeah, some of it, as you saw in the documentary, I mean, there was shock. You had an officer who was indicted and convicted by a black DA, by an Asian judge, by a jury, was convicted, and then you saw a very very unexpected reversal happen in the sentencing. So. Yeah, sorry, I'm getting away. What with the question specifically was about the reaction of the communities to the verdict. I think the Asian American community was, as you saw at the end of the trial. This is something that they had fought very hard for and organized for it was a historic organizing of the Asian American community that had never happened before. So there was cause of celebration. Not just because of the verdict, but because of what they showed that they could do together that they hadn't done before. And from the black community, there's such a sense of, I wouldn't say desensitizing, but it is a result that has been so common and repeated that, as you heard voiced by one of Akai Gurley's friends, Giz, his name is, he said that it was just like, if it's a cop, like you can go out and protest all you want, and you can cause a riot in the streets, but in the end, he's a cop, he's going to get protected. It's sort of the same old. So I think you saw a lot of fatigue on the African American side, and just the kind of sense that when's it going to happen again? And the documentary ends with a litany of voices of families who also suffered from police murders of their kin, and unfortunately for the black community, it is very much. I mean, as it's in the news cycle even as of today, where you hear about regardless of the circumstances, when you have an unarmed black man or woman who is killed by the police, and you see all sorts of explanations coming out. I was actually reading a news article today. The New York Times pulled up in another page, and it was saying that the term the officials are using to describe the event are an accidental discharge, and that the officer thought that it was a taser that she was using. This is the case of Dante Wright that just happened. Yeah, there's a lot of fatigue in the black community, and we've heard the same thing over and over and over and over again. So the reaction it wasn't until George Floyd that you saw that catch on nationally and internationally in the way that it did. I think that there was something very particular about the George Floyd case in 2020 that made it happen in the way that it didn't happen for Akai Gurley, which was that the entire event was recorded crystal clear on video. And in Akai Gurley's case, it was a dark stairwell. There was no video showing what had happened. And so, that's how the communities responded to the verdict.
Okay. The next question is, was there any discussion between the two perspectives in the Asian communities?
Absolutely. One of the key places that you saw that in the documentary was around the table at the restaurant. And again, speaking to that sort of generational divide that we found to be rather common, was that you had a younger Asian American community, which is more liberal leaning, which tended to be more empathetic to the cause of the Black community, and the younger Asian American generation tended to ally themselves with the cause against the institutional power of the police, and saw police as an institution that on the one hand was made to serve and protect, and on the other hand did the exact opposite. And so there was certainly a younger generation of Asian Americans that felt that way, and then there was the older generation of Asian Americans that saw that had a totally different relationship with police, but still a complex one. That's something that I really learned in the cutting of the documentary, is that it's not that there was on the other side of that, there wasn't that there was a total trust of the police or a total trust of the institutions of the justice system. It was more that there was a preference to not say anything and to keep things internalized within the community, and to not make noise about something. Don't call the police. And it's not exactly a blanket endorsement of the police force so much as a tendency not to engage with the justice system in that way. And arguably that has also made the Asian American community, as we've seen, like even in the last month or so, has I think put a sort of target on their back in terms of as it was vocalized in the documentary, and even in some parts of the documentary that didn't ultimately make it in, that the Asian American community saw themselves as easier targets because they were not politically engaged like the Black community was, because they preferred to keep things internalized, because historically the older generation was coming from, take the Chinese example, we're coming from a more of a philosophy or a mentality that's sort of like the nail that kind of sticks out is one that gets hammered down kind of deal. And so there's certainly there's dialogue that happens between the Asian American community, absolutely. But you do find it sort of stratifying between the liberal and conservative point of view. But it's not a typical conservative point of view, is what I'm trying to say. It's still very nuanced. It's not just full-throated Blue Lives Matter support. It's something different than that.
One of the scenes that really jumped out to me was the scene toward the end where two young men are standing on the street, both African American, but both having a very nuanced perspective and engaging in all of the issues that were presented throughout the documentary. I'm just wondering, where did you find those young men? Did you come upon that conversation, or was it prompted?
Right, it was not prompted. So Ursula, I think one of her skills as a director is just the ability to find that. There's also conversations that happened in the Pink House, is just people who were just kind of around. There's a conversation where the mailman comes in the door and the police are there, as they always are. I mean, they're across the street from me now. There's public housing across the street that I can see. It's just there's a what they call a show of force, which means that they're just there. So Ursula she had a way of just sort of seeing things, and so she just approached those two men on the street and asked them questions. And it just so happened for viewers who were kind of eagle-eyed to see, as that conversation was happening, like a troop of 4 or 5 policemen walking across the street in the background in a show of force manner, just patrolling through the neighborhood. And you see police cars passing by in the background, totally unfacilitated. That is just a very tame moment that happened. But you can see in that case as well, you don't have a monolithic point of view from the African American community as well. I think those guys were clearly they were friends, but they had differing points of view in terms of the relationship with the police. And not one was saying that not all officers are bad, and you need the police, and that there are some bad apples, and that the police have a difficult time as well because of the complexity of that force, and how do you root out the bad parts and without spoiling the image of the whole. And so it was very that was totally unfacilitated. I think Ursula just I think that's one of the things that makes her special as a director, is to be able to find moments like that. And another one was just those moments on the periphery of protests that are happening where people are engaging in conversation. yeah, it was one of those special moments that I think makes the documentary very unique in terms of it's not just about who has the megaphone.
Okay. And we have a question here. Do you think or feel that Peter should have gotten jail time?
Personally, as an editor, and I'm not going to dodge the question, but I will say that as an editor, what I wanted to do was approach what happened as I wanted to approach it from the perspectives of both communities, and so it's something that Ursula was very deliberate about too. So I came on board for like 3/4 of the documentary. The first editor that was actually working on this is an Asian American editor named Michelle Chang, and Ursula had cut the previous documentary with her. And then I took over the project from Michelle, and even having the African American perspective and the Asian American perspective, I think brought out different sides in the documentary in terms of in terms of the way that an Asian American looks at the Asian American community, and the way that an African American looks at the African American community, and trying to find an equitable way. They're just things that a certain editor from a certain community will see versus another. Yeah, personally, what I think in this case, what I look at is historical precedent, and so I think it's remarkable that you had, regardless if it was deliberate or not, that you have anytime that you have police murdering of an unarmed person, that results in probation is strange to me, and that's my personal feeling. What I tend to do is look at it from the perspective of what institutionally American power does in the world, and I was probably more disturbed by the similarity between what happened in this case, which is that, okay, Peter gets probation, Kai Gurley's family gets millions of dollars with caveats on it, but is paid a large sum of money by the state, which means that it's people in New York. It's me. Like it's ultimately it's my money that pays for it, and it's the community's money that pays for it. So there isn't really. I don't think there's really a punishment that's doled out on the part of the like the NYPD doesn't suffer. It's actually the people who end up paying that price. And I was disturbed to see the similarities between what happened there and the same sort of thing that the United States has historically done abroad in a wartime situation. In Iraq or Afghanistan, for example, collateral damage happens, and that's a euphemism. Loss of life happens as a result of something that American force does inadvertently, perhaps. The wrong village gets bombed, and the standard operating procedure is to pay for that, the lives lost with money, and it's a transaction that happens, and so yeah, this all kind of winds back to the question of what I thought Peter deserved to get, but I think the more interesting or even disturbing contemplation is but necessary contemplation is around like what is justice in this case anyway? Like what is the real, what is the most palpable form of justice? If the Asian American community doesn't see this as a victory, getting Peter on probation, it's not a victory to the Asian American community. Obviously, the African American community doesn't see the probation as a victory either. So where does justice exist in that? And ultimately, I think it comes down to there being real, actual reform. And I think and the realization that the institution and the systems that we've built to sort of generate or provide justice are broken, and we need to fix that. And I think 2020, for the first time, you started to see some very radical opinions on what that meant in terms of, you saw phrases come out like defund the police and and I say radical in the sense that they just hadn't been said before, but these ideas that then maybe they're not so radical actually, but if they're considered, but yeah, I would rather not answer the question of do I think Peter deserved probation, and I would rather ask the question like what is real justice, because I don't think probation is the answer, and I don't think jail time would have appeased the Black community. I think the ultimate problem is the system, and the more that we continue to just be appeased by, or the more that we pay for accidental discharges and accidents, the more that you just take from the taxpayers and pay that off and give the officers who are the embodiment of this institution, the more you let them off, the more the problem just persists. So that's how I'd answer that question. It's a tough question to answer.
Okay. Our next question is, do you have any knowledge from those who had watched the movie already to either side more with Akai or more with Peter, or remain unchanged?
That's also a very good question. We actually put this film through several screenings with members of the Asian American community, Black community, and well, really generally Latinos, whites, and asked that exact question on the surveys. And we were hoping to do. Well, it'll be interesting as it goes public tonight to see that dialogue start happening. What we found, I think, was a mix. There were, and you would be very surprised to see that some people's minds did change, but I think ultimately, for the most part, what we saw in the audience responses to the surveys was actually people saying how difficult it was to make a call and to say that I support this side or I support that side. And so it's a film that generates an interesting sort of empathy for both communities, and the realization that the struggle is so real for both the communities to deal with what ultimately was a system of white supremacy, a system of historical police power that seems totally beyond consequence, and that you have these officers who are totally abstracted, it seems, from themselves, from their personal actions, because they have the umbrella of the institution around them, and so no individual really is responsible for what they do, because the institution is there, and the institution can't be challenged. Like, it's the ultimate power. And so again, that's I think people come face to face with that when they watch the film, and it's not that they're undecided, but they I think most viewers leave with a greater appreciation of the tough situation that we're in, and the realization that it's not a verdict one way or the other is not going to mean justice for anyone. So yeah,
that seemed to me to be such a beauty of it too. Like you said, it showed both the systemic failures and the systemic racism at that level, and then maybe some individual biases, some individual nuances. And I think you really had to get such amazing access and build such amazing relationships and trust to get that whole nuance, that whole range of nuance. So how was that accomplished? Who was behind the cameras that got such?
Again, it was. I mean, it's all Ursula, and so she had an interesting path to navigate herself too, because she so her last name is Liang, and which is Peter's last name, and actually Ursula's brother's name is Peter, is the Peter Liang. So when she was approaching the Black community and Kirby and Auntie and that side, she made a very deliberate decision not to do it by email or in an impersonal way, but to literally do it in person, and thought that was the only way that she was going to be able to gain their trust, was to in person make her case for why they should give their time to her, why she should have access, and why she would not set out to abuse that. And it was the same thing on the Asian American side where Ursula is a journalist and has been a journalist for some of the greatest news organizations of our time, and that journalistic point of view, I think, protected her and gave her a point of trust with both communities. But it was a years long endeavor, and a lot of the film. So the murder of Akai happened in 2014. And it wasn't until 2015, 2016 that Ursula started filming. And so there's a lot of coverage that we had to, in the edit, make it seem like it was sort of happening in real time. But it was footage that was actually gathered from the Asian American community and the Black community to construct of how life was when the event happened in the first place, and then to sort of build out that story until it became Ursula's camera. And the first time that you see Ursula's camera in the documentary is actually at that first, groundbreaking, historic Asian American protest in Brooklyn, where you had the community coming out for the first time. So, she approaches it as a journalist, and that is an approach that I think served her in the documentary very well. To gain that sort of access to both communities, and she continues to be in touch with both of the communities, it's right up until the premiere. And again, it is, if the pandemic had not happened, I think it would have been very interesting. And hopefully, digitally, we'll see a dialogue between the communities in the way that we've seen happen in the film festivals. Again, I think back to the very beginning of this conversation, these are not two communities that historically have allied in the way that they could have and can in the future, and so hopefully this documentary will stimulate that in some way.
Okay. While watching the film, one of the things that really hit me was this one statement. I might be butchering it, but they said that 1 second earlier or 1 second later, and Akai might not have even been killed. Mm. So when you're talking about justice, the DA came with one charge against Peter. Mm-hmm. But when the sentencing came, the judge came back with a different charge against him. Mm-hmm.
Right.
Were you able to talk to the judge or the DA to gather their opinions or anything like that, their sense of justice?
So that's a good question. So not to the judge. The judge did not make himself available to Ursula, and the DA Ken Thompson unfortunately passed away because of had a heart attack and died. He was very young, and so there wasn't a perspective that could be gathered from them in terms of what was just. And I think there was a lot, and reported in the documentary, there was a lot of, the jury was at least those who spoke to the press afterwards, were not happy with the fact that they had convicted on certain terms and with certain assumed consequences. And then all of a sudden there was just a switch, which in the interim between the conviction and when the final verdict was reached, there was a lot of uproar in the Black community around what Ken Thompson would do and what it appeared that he was preparing to do and ultimately did do, which was ultimately resulted in a reduction of the conviction and a sort of rephrasing of what happened. And that DA was sitting right at the nexus of institutional power and what has historically been an embodiment or a symbol of white supremacist power, the police force. Not that it is holistically whatsoever, but what that DA Ken Thompson had to do was a very difficult thing. Was to be the decision point between what the institution historically just would do, which was let the cop off regardless of the consequences, and the fact that he was a Black man, Ken Thompson was a Black man who came from the communities that were being policed in this way and was supposed to be there as a to change the institution, and you saw how difficult that was in his person, and and his early death was unfortunate. But I don't think we'll ever, for that reason, I don't think we'll ever have that answer in a satisfying way.
Okay. Another question I had is, do you think the reactions would have been the same if the officer and the person who was shot were the same race?
I think all we have to do to answer that question is look at what does happen. I think collateral damage or accidental discharges and such. These are things that unfortunately happen with a certain level of frequency. You saw in the ongoing case right now, in the George Floyd case, that there was a request to sequester the jury because they wanted to protect them from the news of what's happening right now, like as of today in that accidental discharge. And I think the judge ruled against it and said that he said that this sort of thing happens with such frequency, and the world will continue on, and there will be more police killings that happen, and there's no way to protect a jury against that. I think that's the answer to the question, that it's like, unfortunately, it is happening, and it's going to continue to happen until you have some serious form of reform of the institution, and that would be something along the lines of, for example, looking at Europe, for example, where you don't have every police officer on the street carrying a firearm, where you have non-lethal forms of containment, until you have and better mental health resources, for example. There are questions that are rising now more than ever about, like, why when somebody gets pulled over for a traffic stop, why do they fear for their lives? I'm one of those people who worries when I get pulled over about what could happen. Obviously, officers want to protect themselves from what could happen to them, but I think it's arguable that I think it's questionable why any member of the population should fear for their life when something like a blinker is out. So I say all that to say that the institution needs to be dealt with on that level, and the only people that can do it is communities who mobilize together, because they in a way they kind of represent their own institution. So it's very hard for an individual to penetrate and to make a difference, but it's only through allyship that real change is possible. I think that's my belief.
Okay. We have another question. One thing that I would have liked covered, because NYC is highly diverse, it highlights issues we have with police that transcend race. There are issues with police culture and training. Do you have any thoughts about that?
So one thing that was discovered in the documentary, or one thing that was told in the documentary, even though it may have seemed kind of like a footnote, was speaking about police training. For example, there were aspects about the police academy training that were revealed in deposition and in the trial, that these police are not being trained adequately to go into the places that they go into, and that the culture. So you have one, a lack of training, and then two, the police culture that the person asking about. Certainly in New York, walking outside, it's a very there's a posture, and you heard in the doc also the young woman named Kirby who was advocating on the side of Kai Gurley, who was saying when she was growing up, there's a stance, there's a posture, there's a way that they are, that the police are in New York especially, and you could see it too in the beginning of the documentary when you saw the first Kai Gurley protest happening, and there was marches that went to the precinct, and you see the police officers on the top of the roof smiling or smirking or laughing at what was going on below. And there is a certain posture of the police force, which is what it is, and it's very palpable, certainly in New York and on the streets of Brooklyn. That which has a toxicity to it in combination with the lack of training. So send somebody who is sort of inundated in that culture, who has a lack of training, into a project at 1 a.m. Where because of NYCHA not repairing the elevator and the lights are out in the stairwell, it's just like a recipe for disaster. To have someone who has that sort of culture baked into them, they've got a gun, they're afraid, and they're untrained. It's like, what do you expect to happen? So yeah, I keep I sound like a broken record, but I think that a lot of the issues that are with the institutions that skip over really important aspects that could save lives, like CPR. And Peter himself said they don't really learn CPR. They watch somebody do it, and then they check a box. And so, right. Hopefully that answers the question. But yeah, police culture and the lack of training were very critical. I think played critical roles in Akai Gurley's death.
Our next question is, what's the legal difference between the manslaughter charge and the criminally negligent homicide charge?
That is a great question. I wonder, I don't know if I'm the right person, because this is something that I had to Google myself in the editing of the documentary, was to figure out the nuance between the two. I don't know if either of you have a better answer to that question, but it gets into sort of this legalese.
I'm going to defer to Danielle for that.
Yeah.
I appreciate. Yeah, I'm sorry, and in particular to New York law, I don't know, and because we focus on the civil legal law, I don't want to say too much. But yeah, I think Google would probably give you a good nuance of it, especially overview.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the technical difference between the two was the deciding factor between the punishment for the crime. And so to switch to one from the other was a very significant change, and I think allowed for a harsher punishment, or allowed for jail time to be skirted. And so yeah, it's a good question, and it's one of those very important differences.
Okay, we have another question. Can you let us know what Peter is doing and what is his future in the police department? Yeah, so
as far as Ursula knows, and as far as I know, the latest that we did hear, which is the latest that I heard from Ursula about Peter, which was just before the pandemic happened, was that Peter, he ended up finishing his probation and doing his community service. He actually did that community service in the Asian American community, I believe in Chinatown, in the city, in Manhattan. I believe, I'm not absolutely positive where exactly he did it, but I know it was in New York. And then the last that Ursula had heard from him is he was working as a repairman, or as a contractor. He's totally disassociated from the police force. Is certainly no longer an officer. And Peter, as you saw in the documentary, is not someone who craved the spotlight and was looking to sort of disappear back into the community as soon as he could, and that's exactly what he did.
Okay. Now, I know growing up, I didn't hear a lot of these police stories about police misconduct, things like that. But it seems like lately we're hearing more and more stories like this. Mm-hmm. Do you think people have reached a point where they're becoming accustomed to seeing this happening, to a point where they might become emotionally desensitized to all this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I know that, like, in the Black community, it's something that you can't get desensitized to, because you might get killed, like your life might be taken. And so when it comes to, being pulled over, like I was mentioning, being pulled over for an ordinary traffic stop, that could result in the end of your life. And so growing up, for example, I have two brothers, myself and my brothers. My parents taught us what to do in that situation. Put your hands in clear view on the dash or on the steering wheel, and to be extremely cautious, and to not give any remote chance that your actions could be misconstrued. And even then, that doesn't necessarily result in that situation going not ending in you being taken out of the car, like my brother has been, or not ending in a form of violence like we've seen recently. So I don't think the Black community will become desensitized to it, because we're kind of in the crosshairs and have been traditionally for centuries. So in terms of the broader public becoming desensitized to it, I sincerely hope not. I'm part of an advocacy group in the film industry that is trying to bring greater equity to the industry, greater representation to the industry. And what we have seen is that there is some fatigue that has happened from 2020 to now. For example, it's been a year since it seemed like the world exploded with the support of Black Lives Matter. I think there is some fatigue, but I think there are very smart people who are advocating and are very cognizant of the fact that people grow tired and this grows in cycles. But I think that was an inflection point that we reached. And so I do think real change is going to come. I think some people will be fatigued, but I think that there are enough people who I don't want to say woke, but who are awakened now to what's happening, that hopefully change is inevitable.
Now we're seeing like different companies spending more money on diversity initiatives. And I think your film like this really helps bring about discussions about race. Do you have any plans to do more of documentaries along this topic?
I know for a fact, without giving away what Ursula's next projects are, in the pipeline, she absolutely has some very focused and Asian American oriented, but stories that are sort of that flow from the Asian American community, but impact the entire U.S. community and potentially internationally as well. So I know that that's something that's very close to her heart. And then myself as a storyteller, as an editor, and as a director, because I'm telling stories about the Black community, inevitably those become stories about these institutional power structures that we discussed here. It's a fact of life. And so even in the actually in the two projects that I'm working on now, in the Kanye West project is something that you hear him talking about, you know, back when he's in his early 20s, talking about what it means to be a Black man, in a totally different context, being a Black man in America and what that means. I'm editing a series for Apple TV right now where it deals with what happened in around 2001 with the explosion of the MP3 and the effect that had on the music industry, and what Black artists were to the music industry, and who was kind of at the center of all that intrigue. And it turns out that it's rural people. It's the Black community that's often at the very center of some of these really pivotal, just mind-bogglingly impactful events or inflection points in history. So it does, if you're talking about the African American community or the Asian American community, it's guaranteed that it's also going to be something about the communities that touch us as well, because we are communities that are just so deeply ingrained into the culture of what it means to be American. In short, yes, we are all still telling stories about that are adjacent to the story that we told with the Kai Gurley and Peter Liang.
Okay, I think I'm getting the signal to wrap it up because our time is almost up. So I want to thank you, Jason, for taking time to talk to us about your documentary. Like I said, I loved how it was neutral. It left the viewers with their own thoughts, their own decision to make. And thank you, Danielle, for joining us today with Legal Aid Society. Before we go, I just want to do a quick PSA. If you, your family members, someone you know, or community members have experienced xenophobia, discrimination, or harassment, please report the incident. You can do that using the hate crime reporting tool at aapihatecrimes.org, or you could go to your local governmental agencies such as Ohio Civil Rights Commission to report these acts of discrimination. Danielle, giving you some time too. Would you like to say anything else?
No, I just want to thank you so much for highlighting these so important conversations. And as you said, unfortunately more relevant by the day as we read the news. So thank you so much for including legal aid in this.
Okay. And finally, I also want to give a thanks to Johnny Wu. He's been behind the scenes helping make sure that this runs smoothly. So thank you, Johnny. Okay. I guess we are done. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. We're on Facebook. You can go to our website, and we'll try to get back to you as soon as we can. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.